15 humanitarian workers killed one by Israeli forces and buried in a mass grave in southern Gaza, one of the latest atrocities committed by the Israeli army against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
These attacks are absolutely abhorrent, and attacks on aid workers and first responders are absolutely unacceptable, and we are horrified by what has happened.
The 15 humanitarian workers went missing a week before their bodies were found after they were responding to a distress call from civilians being attacked by Israeli troops.
When they arrived, the first team arrived, it was struck, and subsequent teams were also struck as they arrived to collect the wounded.
They included 8 paramedics from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, 6 members of the Palestinian Civil Defense Search and Rescue Teams, and 1 UN staff member. They were found on the 30th of March in a mass grave with multiple gunshots in each one of them. Some were tied up, and one was decapitated, according to Mahmoud Basil, spokesperson for the Palestinian Civil Defense in Gaza. Israeli occupation forces brutally, savagely executed the civil defense teams. The humanitarian workers were buried in a mass grave 2 to 3 meters deep in an attempt to conceal the crime, Basil said. The PRCS, the Palestinian Civil Defense, and the UN staff are the organizations on the ground responsible for conducting search and rescue operations across the Gaza Strip, both in this war and in many previous wars. The available information indicates that the first team was killed by Israeli forces on the 23rd of March, and that the other emergency and aid crews were struck one after another over several hours as they searched for their missing colleagues. They were buried under the sand alongside their completely destroyed emergency vehicles, clearly marked ambulances, a fire truck, and a UN car. The first body was recovered on the 27th of March, and the remaining 14 bodies were recovered 3 days later after complex search operations.
We coordinate our movements with the Israeli authorities to specific areas of Gaza. This is an optional mechanism available to the humanitarians working in Gaza, and it's a mechanism that exists around the world, and basically it provides, it actually assists it's meant to help the parties to the conflict observe their obligations under international law.
Video footage documented the search for the bodies and the recovery process from the mass grave and the sand mounds. The emergency these rescue workers were responding to, according to Ocha and the PRCS, were colleagues who had been shot at earlier in the day, when their clearly marked vehicles came under heavy Israeli fire in Rafah City's Tel Sultan district.
Health workers should never be a target, and yet we're here today digging up a mass grave of first responders and paramedics. We're digging them out in their uniforms, with their gloves on. They were here to save lives. Instead, they ended up in a mass grave. It's an absolute horror. What has happened here? This should never happen.
The funerals for these 15 humanitarian workers that were killed drew in large crowds of hundreds of people mourning their brutal killings. One of the paramedics killed was Ashraf Nasser Abu Labda. His mother told our reporter on the ground in Gaza, "My son volunteered to help the wounded. He did not receive a salary, he loved his work, and he was dedicated to it. The Israeli army are treacherous. They have no honor, no agreements, no integrity. They do not respect any laws or customs." A cousin of one of the paramedics who was killed said the perpetrators of these crimes should be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. There has not been any official response from Israel regarding these killings.
Of course, we know that last year was the deadliest year on record for aid workers, and this is completely unacceptable and outrageous.
These latest killings now bring the death toll of aid workers killed by Israel to at least 408 since the war began a year and a half ago, among them more than 280 UNRWA staff. And according to the UN, at least 1,060 health workers have also been killed.
With these attacks continuing and also happening against the larger background of an absolutely horrific humanitarian situation and the impact of civilians who are absolutely exhausted by hostilities that are now in their 18th month. And of course, massive displacements are continuing to happen, with the displacement orders being issued almost on a daily basis, and several hundreds of thousands of people have now been newly displaced, on top of the 90% of the population that had been displaced earlier, many of them dozens of times. We are continuing to call on protection of civilians, on reinstating the ceasefire immediately and on reopening the crossings for the entry of cargo, because it has now been 1 month since they have been completely shut and nothing has entered Gaza. We are rapidly running out of supplies and facing massive risks of hunger, once again returning to Gaza unless the situation changes rapidly and the crossings are reopened.